listening to our podcast, the Slowpoke Travel podcast. We hope you enjoy our podcast. The podcast starts right now. Slowpoke Travel podcast with Buck and Camera Girl. Ta-da! Hola, and welcome to Slowpoke Travel. Let's go in here and see what's going on in the kitchen. We got Camera Girl experimenting with some recipes. Gonna cook up some gnocchi today. What are you watching? Spencer Tracy? That's what old people do. We just watch old Spencer Tracy movies and eat. But I was working on a seafood gumbo video. But I got to take a break from that chair to go sit in another chair. So I thought I would jaw a little bit about New Orleans. Because we just spent a month in New Orleans and just got back. So I've got some footage coming up of that. So if you want to hear this podcast, just the audio, I'll have a link down below for that. But if you want the visual, I'll have a link down below for that wherever you're looking at this. So we do this podcast on our travel channel and also on whatever our podcast hosting thing is. I can't even think of what it is. What is it? Son of a buck. I should know where my podcast is hosted. But I don't, because my brain doesn't function the way it used to function, because I'm getting older. And after spending a month in New Orleans, I realized that New Orleans is a young man's game. I think I have aged out of New Orleans. We drove into New Orleans on a Saturday and stayed in the Bywater. We had an Airbnb, probably about a 15-minute walk away from the French Quarter. And if you want to check out what that Airbnb looked like, I'll have a link down below. Link, just links up the wazoo. So everything that I talk about, if I got a link to it, it'll be down in the description. So take a peek down there, take a browse if you like. But we drove from Florida to New Orleans, and it was about a 12-hour drive. We actually got just outside of New Orleans the day before we had to be there, because we needed to meet up with the folks that we were doing a house sit for, because we like to meet the folks, ideally a day or a couple of days before we'll do a house sit, so that we can go over whatever we need to know about the property and pets where we're going to be house sitting. So we had booked a house sit for a couple of days prior to the beginning of the start of the house sit. And when we got there, we were kind of dog tired by the time we got to the Airbnb. And Camera Girl, she just zonked out. She just went and got in bed, and that was all she was interested in doing. But it was Saturday night, in New Orleans, and I hadn't been, into that city in, gosh, it'd been 10 years since the last time I was there. No, it was longer than that. I probably hadn't been to the city in a dozen years, and I was very excited, even though it was nighttime and dark out. And my ideas and impressions of the Bywater are from when I lived there before, and I lived there in the 90s, not in the Bywater, but in the French Quarter. And that's, we're talking more than 20 years ago. And at that time, New Orleans was not the safest place in the world. It's probably not the safest right now, although I just spent a month there and it seemed fine. But when I was living there in the 1990s and the early aughts, it was a place you wanted to have eyes in the back of your head. You really needed to be the type of person that was a little bit paranoid and well aware of what was going on around you, which I always was. I mean, I've always considered myself sort of a pessimistic, hyper-aware person, I expect, I don't know, maybe I'm not an optimist, certainly back in the day when I lived in New Orleans. So I was, as vigilant and paranoid as I could be, but even so, I got robbed 3 different times, and that's the only place I've ever really been robbed, was New Orleans. But back then, I think when I lived there, a couple of times when I lived there, it was the murder capital of the United States, leading the country in the murder rate. I don't know, I shouldn't dwell on that sort of negativity, because despite New Orleans having these issues. I mean, I've always loved the city. I've always considered New Orleans my home, although I never really had a home because my dad was in the military and we moved around a lot. But we always were, it seemed like we were in the South a whole bunch. And I spent a good chunk of my life in Louisiana when I was a young person. And as soon as I sort of became my own person or could make my own decisions, the first place I ever lived by myself as an adult was in New Orleans. So I felt like I kind of found myself living in New Orleans. And I lived 4 different places in the city, a couple places in the Garden District and Uptown, and I lived a couple places in the French Quarter. In fact, I had one short stint where I actually lived on Bourbon Street. And for a heartbeat, I actually had an apartment on Bourbon Street, facing Bourbon Street, the busy part of Bourbon Street. But I could only hack that for a couple of weeks. And then as soon as I could get an apartment off of the street, back in the center of the building around the courtyard, I went ahead and moved to that apartment because you cannot live overlooking Bourbon Street, the busy part of Bourbon Street. I thought I could, but the rent wasn't bad and I was young, but even my brain craving stimulation couldn't take that much stimulation. But I was young. I was young back in those days in the 1990s. I guess I was in my mid-20s, I guess, when I started living on my own. I'd always had roommates or been doing seasonal work prior to that. But this time, as someone approaching my 6th decade, I'm much older, and I found that I couldn't relate to a lot of stuff in New Orleans. It looks the same. The city, in a lot of ways, looks exactly as it looked when I was living there, 30 years ago, but it's different. I mean, it's certainly not as inexpensive as it used to be. I think that probably had a lot to do with Katrina. I mean, I was up in Alaska when Katrina hit, and I didn't have to live through the whole Katrina experience in New Orleans, but I think so many people moved out of the city and didn't return. There's a lot of gentrification. Like I said, we were in the Bywater, and where we were staying, where I walked from in the Bywater at night to the French Quarter is not a place that I would have been comfortable walking in the 1990s. Not at all. I mean, there's definitely a lot of dilapidation still in New Orleans, but the Bywaters are really a lot different now. It seems like every other building is an Airbnb. All the shotgun houses, one person lives on one side of the shotgun, and the other half of it is an Airbnb, and it's crazy, the prices. What they want for rentals in that part of New Orleans is kind of silly. Because Camera Girl and I sort of took this house in New Orleans and went to the city sort of with an eye of checking things out and seeing if it was a place we might want to settle down and spend some time. But we couldn't find anything that I was interested in paying for, because I don't want to spend $1,500, $1,600, $1,900 to live on one side of a shotgun. We didn't see any sort of properties or anything that we really wanted to look at. And on this trip to New Orleans, we actually stayed in an area outside of the French Quarter. So when we left the Bywater area, we were staying in a very drivable neighborhood. It was more to the south and west of Carondelet. I was so excited to be in New Orleans, and even though it was dark out, the first thing I did was I said, trying to get Camera Girl to come on out to the French Quarter with me, but she was just dog tired, not interested in it. So I went ahead and put on my britches and headed out into the New Orleans Saturday night. And man, it was packed and crowded everywhere. All along Frenchmen Street, all along Decatur. I walked the length of Decatur, the French Quarter, and then I went over and walked up Royale, and then I walked a little bit along Bourbon Street. But I didn't go to the super duper busy part of Bourbon Street. I was sort of turned off by the noise. I've got a little tinnitus. now that I'm getting older. And I tell you, going into some of these bars where the music was blaring, it just didn't have any appeal to me. I walked by my old place where I used to live on Burgundy Street. Everything looks the same, but it's a little bit different. It doesn't feel as neighborhoodly as it did when I lived there before. You know, there's nothing that you can do and not end up saying things like, well, it wasn't like it was when I was there before. Well, it wasn't like it used to be. Well, you know, things have changed. Well, of course they've changed. Things always change, and you can never go back. And the worst thing you can do, not the worst thing you can do, but a very basic mistake, maybe mistake's not the right word, a wrong frame of mind. What is it? What am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is you're going to be disappointed if you think that you can find something that you left behind, like an experience or a place, because that place is going to be changed to whatever degree that it's going to change. And it might just be a small degree, but you're also going to change. I'm a different person than when I lived there. So not only has the place changed, but I've changed. So the chances of getting back in sync with that experience are almost nil. You can't go back. What is that? Is that a Thomas Wolfe thing? You can never go home? I don't know what it is, but whatever it is, it's true. You can't go back. And I'm pretty good. You know, I've learned that enough. I've had that experience enough to where I don't expect it to be the same. But I was kind of surprised how I felt this time. I don't know if I found a way into the city in my mind. I think Camera Girl actually did a little better than I did. Of course, I've gotten cheaper as I get older, so I'm a little bit put off by the price of everything now. Oh my God. You know, if you asked me where the best po' boy in New Orleans was, I would always say it was at the Quartermaster, which was a little grocery store in the quiet end of Bourbon Street. I've eaten so many po' boys there. I used to always get a hot sausage po' boy, and I think it used to be 3 1/4, just a dressed hot sausage po' boy. You know, to get it on Bourbon Street, to get it in the French Quarter for 3 1/4, and to have it be delicious. Go in there, order that, go sit on Royale Street and listen to people play music on the street. I mean, just one of my favorite memories. And it was just a kind of a divey little grocery store, very dilapidated, open 24 hours, I think. Even though it was a place that you could go to, you know, at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, you know, and get a sandwich, you know, and then take it home, or even get it delivered. You could get delivery from that place, I think 24 hours a day. I mean, so many times I would get hamburgers or po' boys delivered from there, you know, if I didn't feel like leaving my little hovel. Man, I went in there this time. It looked like, you know, I walked into it, it didn't exactly look the same outside because the little sign was gone. It was a different sign, but it seemed so sanitized inside. It looked like it almost made me feel like I was at like a little grocery kiosk in an airport. It was disappointing. Oh, golly. Sound like some old disgruntled grandpa. Oh, things are so expensive now, and they're not nearly as good as they used to be. But it was disheartening. And the thing is, nobody would go into the Quartermaster now and think that they had the best po' boy in the city. Nobody would go in there and think that. I can't imagine anybody going there and ordering a sandwich and think they had discovered something. Whereas many years ago, that's how I felt about the Quartermaster. I felt like it was a secret place that locals knew about, people that lived in the quarter knew about. If you were a tourist and you were lucky enough to stumble on it, you know, then that good for you. But I just can't imagine anybody having that experience now. And the thing was, some of the same people that were there 20 years ago were still there, which made me happy, but I don't know. Next time I go to New Orleans, I will not go to the Quartermaster and get a sandwich. Nothing against the Quartermaster. I mean, it was very clean. It was very nice. You know, it's probably a great place to get a bottle of water, you know, if you've had too much to drink on Bourbon Street. But I was unable to make that connection with the old life I had there through the quartermaster. And that was the only place I went into on Bourbon Street. I didn't go to Lafitte's blacksmith shop, which was another place that I used to like to go. I didn't go to any places, really. I just walked around the quarter. People were wearing masks, some people. A lot of people weren't. But it was very crowded. And a bar that I used to frequent a lot, too much, when I lived in the quarter years ago was the Abbey in Lower Decatur, just down from Molly's at the Market. Just before you get to Esplanade and Checkpoint Charlie, right there in that Lower Decatur area is the Abbey Bar. I spent so many hours at the Abbey. Mornings, lots of late nights. It was open 24 hours a day. I don't know if it's still open 24 hours a day now, but any time of the day or night you could go to the Abbey Bar. And I went to it this time, and it was probably about 10 o'clock at night. And I went in, it was pretty much empty. There was a couple of fellas sitting a little further down the bar and the bartender. Because the Abbey, I don't know, it was pretty busy during the day, but it would be pretty dead until after midnight. It's a place that people find after hours, or that's how it used to be. But I went in this time, sat down and pulled up a stool, and the bartender came up and asked me for my vaccination card, which I didn't have. I didn't know I was going to have to show my vaccination card. But, so I ended up not having a drink because I didn't have it on me. But the rest of the time when we were in New Orleans, we carried our little vaccination card because half the places that we would go to would ask us. I think all the places were maybe supposed to ask, or maybe only if you were going to stay inside the establishment and eat or drink. But a few places did ask us to verify that we had our vaccine. So they're very hyper vigilant of it there because, you know, they have such an influx of tourists, especially with Mardi Gras coming up. But it was strange walking around at night, especially in the Bywater, which was crowded too. And it just didn't have the same feeling of danger because there were so many more people out on the street than when I lived there before in the 90s. There was a lot more businesses that were thriving. Definitely more of an upscale area now. I remember drinking at the Apple Barrel one time, and I was hanging out with this guy. I wasn't hanging out with this guy, but he was a fella I knew from the neighborhood, and he was in there when I was in there, and we were just kind of sitting at the bar together, and he was leaning back in his stool. I didn't know him that well. I just knew him from the bars. But he was a little strange-looking guy. He had a little pork pie hat. See him all over the place. Sometimes I'd see him at open mics. He liked to play guitar and sing. Terrible guitar player, terrible singer. But he had a lot of style. He was a very interesting, definitely a New Orleans character. I can't think of his name right now, and I wouldn't say it anyway. But everybody knew him. I'd see him at all kinds of bars. He was always in the Abbey, or he was at Molly's at the Market, or he was at Checkpoint Charlie's, or he was at the Apple Barrel. Those are the main places I saw him. But I'd see him up and down the street. I know he played open mics sometimes. Sometimes he would open for a band. You know, if he knew the folks in the band, like he would open for them like as a favor, or they were doing him a favor because he wasn't good enough to be a professional musician. But he was a really interesting guy, and a lot of times he was drunk. A lot of times I had a bit to drink, but he was always drunker than I was, or at least that's how I remember it. But we were in the Apple Barrel, and he was on this stool, you know, just kind of leaning back. You know, a stool about that high, you know, a bar stool, kind of high off the ground, no back to it. And he toppled over backwards, smacked, landed right on the back of his head. Holy cow. I mean, it just seemed like a fall he might not even have survived. So I remember the bartender looking over the bar, and I remember me looking down at him. You know, I jumped off my bar stool, you know, to help him up, you know, and he was a little discombobulated. And he was 7 sheets to the wind. But the bartender decided to cut him off right then, which he wasn't happy about. But so he had to leave the bar. And so I left with him because I was a little concerned about him because I thought, this guy might have a concussion. This guy, I mean, he was a little strange to begin with. So, I mean, he seemed maybe like he might have had some brain damage even before the fall. So there was no way to tell because that was kind of his personality. But I followed him out of the bar because he was on his way home. He was going to walk home. And I said, well, I'll make sure he gets home all right. And so I'm kind of walking with him down Frenchman Street, and then we cross over Elysian Fields, and we're heading into the Bywater, and we're going down St. Claude, and we're heading down St. Claude, and we're just getting further and further away from the quarter and away from the Faubourg Marigny and deeper into the Bywater. And then we crossed St. Claude over into the whatever the hell's on the other side of St. Claude. And I never went down in that area, especially, at like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning or wherever the hell it was. And I'm just thinking, I'm just an idiot because I'm probably not going to survive this trip. I'm just walking further and further away from the areas where I feel safe into the area where I feel the least safe. With, and I've been drinking, this guy's been drinking, I'm going to have to go back home by myself. And I'm just thinking, this is not smart. And this guy that I'm with, he's looking at me like I'm a threat to him. He's like, why are you following me? Why are you tagging along with me? Because I know the guy, but I don't know him that well. He doesn't understand why I'm going home with him. I'm like, I'll just make sure you get home. I think he thought that I was trying to make a move on him in a relationship type manner, which I wasn't, but but I think that must have been what he was thinking, or he thought I was going to rob him. I don't know what he thought, but he seemed concerned and a little confused by why I was following him. But anyway, we walked across St. Claude and down, I can't remember what the hell street it was, quite a ways into no man's land, to this dilapidated shotgun where he lived. And so he went up the steps to this shotgun and opened his door and kind of looked at me a little strange and bleary-eyed, and then went in and shut the door. And now here I was, standing on the street in a strange part of town at a bad hour of night, feeling like I was lucky to have gotten that far. Now, how the hell am I going to get all the way back to the quarter without getting accosted in an unpleasant manner? And just then, a magic taxi cab pulled up and stopped right in front of me. And, this was before cell phones. Nobody had a phone in their pocket back in these days. But I don't know. I probably just looked lost. I don't know what it was. The fairy angels came to save me. But he stopped right there, and I opened the door and got in. Went back to the quarter in this cab, and that's how I survived. But that's one of my most favorite memories. And I can't think of that guy's name. But he was a little bit younger than me. But he committed suicide. I saw, this wasn't that long ago. Well, it's probably been 10 years ago now. But somebody wrote a song about him. And a lot of people, not a lot of people, but I can probably think of 5 people younger than myself that I was aware of in New Orleans that are no longer alive. New Orleans, if you lived in the French Quarter, if you lived in the Bywater area, it just wasn't a healthy place. People burn brighter there, but they burn out younger. So that fella committed suicide. There was another young fella that I can think of who committed suicide. There was another fella I know who was a bartender who was younger than me. He died of something or whatever. I don't know. There was another guy who was a musician who was a few years younger than me. He died of something. But I remember being so happy living in the French Quarter, especially the last time I lived there. And I lived for 3 years on Burgundy Street, and I was working at one of the downtown hotels in the restaurant, and I just had a great life. because I didn't have to work a whole lot because my cost of living was so low. You know, I lived in this little dinky, they call it a slave quarter apartment, which is the old servant slave quarters behind the main building, were these small, narrow apartments that you couldn't even put a couch in. You know, you could barely fit, you know, a full-size bed in there. But I lived in one of those for pretty cheap rent, and I didn't have any bills. So all I had to do was pay my bar bills and my rent and, you know, eating out and whatever. And so I was able to do that without having to work a whole lot. So I had a lot of free time. I had a little red bicycle with a basket on the front, and I just pedal all over the French Quarter and buy water down to, what the hell's that place? Yeah, just can't remember stuff. But one thing that I noticed living there is that people looked old fast. You know, people just always looked older than they were because it was such a drinking culture. I mean, when I would leave my house, I think it was 50 feet. You know, if I walked out my front door, it was, if I went to the right, I'd be at a bar, you know, in 50 feet, 50 steps. And if I went to the left, it was 75 steps. You know, there was a bar on either corner of my street, and if I went around the corner, I mean, you know, I would pass, you know, 50 bars just going to work. Just crazy, crazy, crazy. But such a wonderful life for a younger version of me. But after 3 years, I ended up leaving because I couldn't imagine continuing that life for another 5 or 10 years without becoming some kind of casualty. It's just not a healthy place to live. Certainly not as a young man trying to have an interesting existence. That takes a toll. Man. And I sure didn't recapture it on this last little trip. But I love New Orleans, and we'll probably give it another shot. I think it was hard to capture the magic of New Orleans this time because I was in that area that I'm familiar with for such a brief period of time. And then we went to this house sit, which was in a more drivable part of New Orleans, which was good because we drove there, and it was nice having a place to park the car and not have to worry about it. But I think I would like to return to New Orleans and maybe live in a more walkable area. It's just going to be hard to find something that I'm willing to pay for. Because now that I've had a taste of Mexico, it's hard for me to match my expectations with what I got to pay for them in this country. But, you know, during COVID times, you know, maybe this is the way to go. But anyway, that's it. A lot of rambling here. And I'll put some images, you know. But if you reach this part of the podcast, you probably saw those images if you're on YouTube. But if you're listening to this, you know, go over to Slowpoke Travel on our YouTube channel, and you can see a visual component of this podcast. And I'll put some scenes from driving around New Orleans behind this. But thanks for listening. Thanks for supporting everything we do, and especially over on our cooking channel. You know, I've made a few batches of gumbo while we were in New Orleans, and so I'm going to edit those gumbo videos together and try to make some healthier gumbo now that we're back here at my mother-in-law's for a little bit before we head out some other place. But you could check out, you know, our cooking channel, link down below, link. I hope everybody's doing alrighty. Hope you're doing wunderbar. Camera Girl and I are doing super duper. We're kind of treading lightly, getting out and about. You know, for all of our COVID whining, we've actually been semi-busy this year. And hopefully 2022 we'll have even more going on. But that's it. Be good to yourself. Be good to your neighbors. Blah, blah, blah. We'll see you in the future. Bye-bye. Alrighty, that is it. Click, subscribe, review, share all over the global internet sphere. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time on the Slowpoke Travel Podcast.